My husband's funeral was on a Thursday. I know that seems like an odd detail to lead with, the day of the week, but it has stayed with me in a way I cannot explain. The way certain specific and arbitrary facts attach themselves to the worst moments of your life and refuse to be dislodged. Thursday. I had always liked Thursdays. The week almost over, the weekend close enough to feel. I have not felt the same about Thursdays since. Gregory died on a Monday. Heart attack. Sudden, which is the word everyone used. Sudden. As if the suddenness were the thing that needed to be communicated first, before anything else, before the fact of it. He was 53 years old. He had been at work, at his desk, in the office he had occupied for 11 years at the engineering firm in the Galleria area where he was a senior partner. His assistant had found him at 2 in the afternoon. She had called 911, and then she had called me, and I had driven to the hospital, and by the time I arrived, it was already finished. We had been married for 26 years. The funeral was at our church in River Oaks, the one we had attended for the better part of our marriage, where Gregory had been an elder and where our children had been baptized and confirmed, and where I had expected, in the dim and abstract way that you expect things that are still very far away, that I would eventually have his funeral. I had not expected to have it when he was 53. 300 people came. Before I tell you the rest, subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it will stay with you. And drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the woman in the third row. I did not notice her during the service. That is the honest answer, and I want to be honest from the beginning. I was sitting in the front row with our 2 children, our son James, who is 23, and our daughter Claire, who is 20. And I was doing the specific work of being present in a room full of people who needed something from me, which is what funerals require of the widow. The performance of a grief that is real, but must also be managed, shaped into something the room can receive. I was shaking hands and nodding and accepting embraces from people I had known for decades and people I was meeting for the first time, and I was holding my children's hands when they needed holding and releasing them when they did not. And I was not, in those 2 hours, looking at the third row. She came to me at the reception. We held the reception at the house, our house, the one Gregory and I had lived in for 19 years in West University Place, the house with the live oaks in the front and the garden in the back that Gregory had always meant to tend more seriously and never quite found the time. 300 people filled it to a degree I had not anticipated, and that required a specific management of my own body. Where to stand, how to move, when to step outside for air. She found me near the kitchen door at approximately 4 in the afternoon. She was about 40, dark hair, pulled back. The kind of face that would be beautiful if it were not so clearly in the grip of something. Pale, composed in the effortful way of someone who has been crying and has stopped and is concentrating very hard on continuing to be stopped. She was wearing black. She had been crying harder than anyone in the room during the service, which is how the people who told me about it described it later. Harder than anyone in the room. She said, "My name is Catherine. I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am not here to hurt you. I am here because I believe you deserve to know, and because I could not look at your face from 3 rows back and say nothing." I looked at her. I said, "Tell me." She said, "I have known Gregory for 4 years. We met through work. I am also an engineer. We worked on a project together in 2019. We became close. Very close." She paused. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone choosing the most precise words available. I loved him, and I believe he loved me. And I am telling you this because he is gone, and you are the person he belonged to for 26 years. And I think the truth belongs to you more than the secret does. The kitchen door was behind me. The house was full of people. I said, "How long?" She said, 4 years. I said, "Did he intend to leave me?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "No, he was not going to leave. He told me that. I accepted it. I want to be clear that I am not here to claim something that was not mine. I am here because he died, and I have no one to grieve with, and because keeping this seemed wrong." I looked at this woman standing in my kitchen doorway at my husband's funeral reception, and I thought about 26 years and 53 years old, and the word sudden, and the particular quality of the last Monday morning I had spent with Gregory, which had been ordinary in every way. Coffee, the news, him forgetting his phone on the counter and coming back for it, the door closing. I said, "I need you to leave now." She said, "I understand." I said, "Give me your phone number. I will call you when I am ready." She gave it to me. She left. I stood in my kitchen doorway and I looked at my house full of people who had come to mourn my husband, and I thought, none of them know. And I thought, I did not know. And I thought, he is not here to ask. My name is Margaret. I was married to Gregory Holt for 26 years. I am telling you this story now, 11 months after his funeral, because I have spent those 11 months doing the specific and non-linear work of understanding what I was told in my kitchen doorway, and because I believe the story deserves to be told completely, not partially. Gregory and I met in Houston in 1996 when I was 27 and he was 28. We were introduced by mutual friends at a dinner party in Montrose, the kind of dinner party that young professionals in their late 20s attended in that era. Everyone a little dressed up, everyone a little hopeful, the evening organized by someone who had said the words, "You two should meet," and turned out to be correct. He was tall, quiet, precise in the way of engineers. He would not say 3 words when 2 would do, and the 2 he chose were always the right 2. I found this extraordinary. I have always been a person who says 5 words when 3 would do, and the presence of someone who moved differently through language was, to me, immediately compelling. We were engaged within a year, married within 2. We built our life the way people build lives when they are serious about the building, deliberately, together, with the specific attention of 2 people who had both watched marriages fail in their families of origin and had decided to be different. We talked about everything. We had a rule, early on, that we would not let things fester. That if something was wrong, we would say so, directly, without waiting for the right moment. We were not perfect at this rule. No one is perfect at any rule they set for themselves. But we tried. I want to tell you something about what trying looked like, in practice, over 26 years. Because it was not always the thing I had imagined it would be when we were young and newly married, and the rule felt simple. There were years when trying meant sitting in a kitchen at midnight, with both of us exhausted, having the conversation we had been putting off all week because the week had been too full. There were years when trying meant going to a couples therapist. Yes, we did this for about a year when James was 9 and Claire was 6, and we had lost the ability to talk to each other in the way we needed to without a third person in the room to hold the space. There was a period when Gregory worked in a way that left very little room for me, and I told him so, and we negotiated, imperfectly, and came out the other side. There was a period when I was building my practice, and he felt I was not present, and he told me, and we negotiated that too, imperfectly, and came out the other side. We were, I thought, people who came out the other side. That was the story of us. Not the story of a perfect marriage, but the story of a marriage that chose itself, repeatedly, over the years, through the specific and ongoing work of choosing. I thought I knew what we were. 26 years, James and Claire. The house in West University Place. Vacations to places Gregory had always wanted to see. The Pacific Coast, Scotland, a week in Japan that he had talked about for a decade, and that we finally took for our 25th anniversary, the year before he died. He had stood on a bridge in Kyoto in the autumn light and turned to me and said, "I should have done this 20 years ago." I said, "We did it now." He said, "Yes, we did it now." That was 14 months before his funeral. I want to tell you about the 11 months after Catherine left my kitchen doorway, because they are the real story. I did not call her immediately. I was not ready to call her immediately. I was not ready to have a conversation with a living person about a dead one. Not in those first weeks, when grief was still the loudest thing and everything else was noise beneath it. I was in the specific early grief that comes after a sudden death, the administrative grief, the paperwork, the calls, the decisions that have to be made when a person who was supposed to be there to help make them is not. The death certificate, the estate, Gregory's office, his things. I called his assistant, Elena, who had found him. She came to the house and I asked her to tell me about that Monday because I needed to know it, needed to hear what the last day had looked like from someone who had been there. She told me. He had come in at 8, which was his usual time. He had had 2 morning meetings. He had eaten lunch at his desk. She had brought it from the deli on the corner, the usual order, the one she always placed on Mondays. At 2, she had knocked on his door with a question about a contract, and he had not answered, and she had opened the door. I asked, "Was he on the phone?" She said, "No. His phone was face down on the desk." She had checked it after to call his contacts, to know who to reach. She had found my number and called me. I said, "Did you look at his messages?" She said, "I saw one. I didn't mean to. The screen lit up when I picked it up. There was a message from a number I didn't know." I said, "What did it say?" She looked at her hands. She said, "It said, 'Thinking of you today. Lunch next week?'" I said, "Okay, thank you for telling me." She said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holt." I said, "So am I." I called Catherine in October, 6 weeks after the funeral. She answered immediately. She said, "I was wondering if you'd call." I said, "I need to ask you things. I need you to answer them honestly. Can you do that?" She said, "Yes." I asked her everything I needed to know. Not the details. I did not want the details, the specific geography of a 4-year relationship I had not known existed, the particular moments and places and conversations. What I needed was the shape, the structure, the answer to the questions that had been living in me since the kitchen doorway. Did he talk about me? She said, "Yes. He spoke about you with respect and with love. He did not minimize you or the marriage." Did he want to leave? She said, "No." I asked him once, early on, and he was clear. He said he was not going to leave. I understood that. Did you want him to? She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I told myself I didn't. I think the truth is more complicated than that." Was he happy? She stopped. She said, "I think he was a person who had compartmentalized his happiness so completely that he did not know what a non-compartmentalized version would look like. I think he was happy with you in the ways that mattered to him. I think he was also something else with me. I don't know a clean word for it." I sat with that answer for a long time. I said, "Why did you come to the funeral?" She said, "Because I had no other place to grieve. Because he was gone, and I could not tell anyone why I was in pain, and I needed to be somewhere that acknowledged the fact of his death, even if no one there knew who I was in relation to it." I said, "That makes sense." She said, "I am sorry. I am sorry for what this has done to your memory of him." I thought about that when I decided to come, and I decided that your right to know outweighed my right to protect my own privacy. I may have been wrong. I said, "You were not wrong." She said, "I hope not." I said, "I need to think about some things. I may call you again." She said, "I'll answer." I want to tell you what I thought about in the weeks after that phone call because it is the part of this story that is hardest to explain. I thought about 26 years and what I knew about them and what I had not known. I thought about the Monday mornings and the Sunday evenings and the trip to Japan and the rule about not letting things fester. I thought about what compartmentalization meant in the context of a person I had believed I knew completely. I am a therapist. I have been a therapist for 22 years, which means I have spent my professional life sitting with other people's secrets and other people's compartments, and the specific damage that unexamined interior lives do to the people who live them and the people who love them. I know what compartmentalization is, clinically. I know how it forms, how it sustains itself, how the person who practices it can be entirely genuine in every compartment and still be, structurally, a kind of liar. I know all of this. Knowing it professionally did not make it easier to apply to my own husband. I want to tell you something about the specific cruelty of being a therapist who is also a widow who has just been told her husband had a 4-year relationship she knew nothing about. The cruelty is this. I knew exactly what was happening inside me. I could name every stage of the process, identify the defenses as they formed, trace the grief to its specific sources. The knowledge did not help. Understanding the mechanics of your own pain is not the same as being less in pain. It is sometimes worse. You cannot even have the relief of not knowing what you are doing. I went to my own therapist, a woman named Dr. Susan Park, who practices in the medical center and who has been my therapist on and off for 12 years. I told her everything: the funeral, the kitchen doorway, the phone call with Catherine, the 11 months of thinking. She listened without interrupting, which is the professional gift and the human gift she has always given me. She said, "What do you need to understand that you don't understand yet?" I said, "I need to understand how the rule didn't work. We had a rule. We were people who talked. I need to understand how 26 years of being people who talked produced a person who held something this large for 4 years without saying it." She said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think the rule only works when both people are willing to surface the thing that needs to be said. And I think Gregory was not willing. Not because he didn't believe in the rule, I think he believed in it, but because the specific thing he would have had to surface was a thing he could not find a way to surface without losing something he was not willing to lose." She said, "And what does that tell you about the marriage?" I sat with that for a long time. I said, "It tells me the marriage was real, and also incomplete. That we had built something genuine, and also that there was something inside him I never had access to. And that the rule we made was only as good as both of our willingness to use it." She said, "Can you hold both of those things?" I said, "I'm learning to." What I came to over those weeks was not a clean conclusion. I want to be honest about that because clean conclusions are often false ones. What I came to was something more like a series of truths that I had to learn to hold simultaneously. The first truth: Gregory had done something wrong. He had maintained a relationship for 4 years that he had hidden from me, that represented a breach of the terms of our marriage, and that he had chosen to sustain rather than end or disclose. That is true, and it is not canceled by anything else that is also true. The second truth: Gregory had loved me. I do not believe, after the phone call with Catherine and the 11 months of reflection since, that the love was false. I believe he loved me in the ways he knew how to love, and that he also had a capacity for love that had found an additional channel, one he kept separate, and that both things were real. The third truth: I will never be able to ask him about it. He is dead. He died on a Monday at his desk with his phone face down, and the conversation I needed to have with him, the specific, direct, honest conversation that was the rule we had made together, is a conversation I cannot have. That absence is its own kind of grief, layered on top of the grief that was already there. The fourth truth: Catherine is a person, not a concept. She loved him too, in whatever form that love took. She came to his funeral and sat in the third row and cried harder than anyone, and then stood in my kitchen doorway and told me the truth because she thought I deserved it. I have held that choice in my mind many times. It was a generous choice. It was also, I think, a necessary one for her. She needed to give me the truth because carrying it alone had become unbearable. I want to say something about Catherine that I have thought about carefully. She is a person who made a choice I am still working out what to do with. Not the 4 years, which is its own territory, but the decision to come to the funeral and the decision to speak to me. In the months since I called her, I have thought about what it would have cost her to make those decisions. To dress in black and sit 3 rows back and grieve publicly for a person no one knew she had any right to grieve. To walk to a widow at the widow's husband's reception and say, "I need to tell you something." I do not think of her kindly in the way that implies forgiveness for the 4 years. I am not there, and I may not get there, and I am not certain forgiveness is the right category for what I am working toward. But I think of her honestly, which means I acknowledge that she is a person who made a hard choice in a painful moment, and that the choice she made gave me something I needed, even as it cost me something I cannot fully name. She and Gregory are both, in a sense, people I no longer know as well as I thought I did. Him because he is dead and cannot tell me. Her because I only know her in this context, the context of the kitchen doorway and 2 phone calls. What I know is limited. I am trying to hold that limitation without filling it with things I imagine, because the imagined version is almost always worse than the true one, and I have enough true things to hold without adding invented ones. I called her a second time in December. I needed to say one thing, and I said it. I said, "I want to thank you for telling me. Not for what you told me. I do not thank you for that. That is its own thing. But for the telling. For deciding I deserved to know." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I wasn't sure it was the right thing." I said, "It was." I live in the truth of my life, not the version I believed was true. What you gave me was the actual truth. That is what I needed, even when it was not what I wanted. She said, "I'm glad." I said, "I don't know if we'll talk again." She said, "I understand. Whatever you need." I have not called her since. I do not think I will. We are not, and cannot be, anything to each other in any straightforward sense. What we are is two people who were each changed by the same person, in different ways, and who found ourselves in the same kitchen doorway on a Thursday afternoon, and who chose honesty over silence. That is what we are. It is enough. I want to tell you about James and Claire because they are part of this story, and I have thought carefully about how much to carry for them. I have not told them. I want to be honest about that choice. I have held this for 11 months without telling my children, and I have made that choice deliberately, and I continue to make it every day. My reasoning is this. They are 23 and 20. They lost their father suddenly at 53, when he was supposed to have decades left. They are in the specific grief of children who have lost a parent too early, the particular disorientation of a world that no longer contains someone who was supposed to be there. I do not want to add to that grief a complication that cannot be resolved, that their father cannot answer for, that would change their memory of him without giving them any way to reconcile the change. I may tell them someday, when they are older, when the acute grief has settled into something more manageable, when I understand better what telling them would give them and what it would cost. I may never tell them. I have made peace with not knowing yet. What I have told them is this. Your father was a complicated person, as most people are, and he loved you completely, which was not complicated at all. James said, "What does complicated mean?" I said, "It means he was a full person, with things inside him I didn't always know about. That's true of everyone. It doesn't make the love less real." He looked at me for a moment. He has Gregory's eyes, the specific gray of them, the quality of attention they carry. Looking at James is sometimes the hardest thing I do. He said, "Okay, Mom." I said, "Okay." Claire is different from James in the way that siblings are different. She processes outward, where he processes inward. She calls me often and talks for a long time and asks questions she does not always want the answers to. She called me in September, 4 months after the funeral, and said, "Do you ever feel like you didn't really know him?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, I feel like I knew him as my dad, but I don't know if I knew him as a person. Does that make sense?" I said, "It makes a great deal of sense." She said, "Is that normal? To feel like the person you lost was also someone you didn't fully know?" I said, "Yes, that is very normal. We know the people we love in the ways they let us know them, and there are always parts they keep. That doesn't mean the knowing was false." She said, "That's sad." I said, "It is, and it's also just true." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I miss him." I said, "So do I." We talked for another hour about other things. When she hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. There is a Saturday in November I want to describe. 2 months ago. I was in the backyard, the garden Gregory had always meant to tend more seriously, and I was, for the first time since he died, actually tending it. Not because I had planned to, because it was November and the garden was overgrown and I had gone outside with coffee and ended up staying. It took 4 hours. I pulled things that needed pulling and cut things that needed cutting, and I worked through the garden systematically, the way I work through hard things, section by section, without looking at the whole, just the part immediately in front of me. By the time I reached the back corner by the fence, the light had changed to the particular gold of Houston November, which is still warm, still bright, not yet the pale of winter. In the back corner, behind a stand of ornamental grass that had grown untended and large, I found a rose he had planted the year we moved in. I had not known it was there, or I had known once and forgotten, the way you forget the particulars of a garden you are not tending. It was overgrown, thorny, neglected in the specific way of a living thing that has been given what it needs by the ground without being given what it needs by a person. Still alive. Difficult and very much still alive. I sat in the garden in the November afternoon with dirt on my hands, and I thought about 26 years, and 4 years, and the trip to Japan, and the bridge in Kyoto, and what he had said. We did it now. I thought, yes, we did it. Whatever else was also true, that was also true. We stood on that bridge, and the light was the way it was, and he said what he said, and I believed it, and I still believe it, because believing something true is not made false by the discovery of other things that are also true. He was a complicated person. He loved me completely. Both things. I pruned the rose. I gave it water. I do not know if it will bloom in the spring. It is November. It is late. It has been a long time without attention. But I intend to find out. I intend to be in that garden in April and see. I am still learning to hold both things. That is the story I am keeping.